Rachel, I know in this coming week, as we kick off in the next few days, there's going to be all sorts of activity on Capitol Hill. Everything from red flag laws to attempts to institute buyback programs. Give me a little insight as to what's going on the Hill in the next few days.
Yeah, the House, led by Democrats, is very, very ginned up on this issue. They want to pass red flag laws. They want to ban high-capacity magazines. A lot of them are talking about reinstituting the assault weapons ban, which you heard in that clip, which, to clarify, never actually banned assault weapons because there's no federal definition of assault weapon.
Scary black rifles.
Correct, yeah, and it actually just banned cosmetic features of certain weapons, and that's all it did. But we're going to see this coming out of the Democrat House, and I think it's going to put pressure on some Republicans to take a position on whether or not you want to be for red flag laws or for some of these things, or you want to stand up for Second Amendment rights. And so the Republican Senate, you've heard Majority Leader Mitch McConnell say he is not going to put a piece of gun legislation on the floor of the Senate unless the president will sign it. And there's a lot of confusion, I think, about where the president stands. I think the president has been clear that he wants to protect Second Amendment rights. However, members of his family are for red flag laws. So I think there's a lot of confusion over where I think this debate is going to go in the next week.
I think confusion is the operative word. John, you're a master of facts and data and statistics. You're an empiricist. After this video clip we just saw, I mean, what does your lifelong study in this field tell you?
Well, I guess frustration. I mean, I want to do something. I see these mass public shootings. I've been talking about what can be done to stop them for 20 years now. But I listen to the proposals, like background checks on private transfers of guns. It's been the #1 proposal for years by Democrats. And yet there's not one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped by having that law in effect.
So, I mean, you can't say that enough. In the last century, background checks, the type they're talking about, would not have resulted in preventing.
Not a single one of these attacks. And, you know, you want to be serious. If they really care about these things as much as they say, then let's look at things that actually do matter. I mean, to me, one of the big things is these gun-free zones. We have virtually all these mass public shootings, about 95% of them keep on occurring in places where people aren't allowed to protect themselves. These killers may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. They want to go to places where victims can't defend themselves because they know the more people they can kill, the more media attention that they can get.
And what's so counterintuitive is that everything else that we value, we guard, right? Whether it's a bank, whether it's a public official, whether it's some sensitive government installation, anything that we think has some sort of value or merit that we hold dear, we guard, often with folks that are armed.
Right.
And then we create gun-free zones that are essentially targets for lunatics and the disgruntled to act violently against.
Look, anybody who reads the diaries or looks at other statements for these killers know that they've put a lot of planning into these attacks. I mean, 6 months is about the shortest amount of time. A year, 2 years. The Sandy Hook killer spent 2.5 years planning these attacks. These guys are obsessed with getting more media attention than other attacks have. You'll frequently say, if I can only kill more people than such and such did, I can get even more media attention. And so, you know, it's not too surprising or shocking that they look to see who might be able to stop them. You know, and guards are helpful, but guards, a police officer at a school has real limits. If you have one person in uniform at a school who's identified as a guard and he's the only person with a gun, these killers have real strategic advantages. Who's the first person that they're going to kill in that case? Because they know if they kill that person, they're going to have free reign to go after other people there. The advantage of having teachers carrying is that you take away that strategic advantage.
Correct.
The killer doesn't know who it is that they have to take out first. I mean, anybody, you know, nationwide, we have over 7% of the adult population with a concealed carry permit. You go to movie theaters or restaurants or grocery stores, and it's very likely that somebody nearby you has a concealed handgun, but you would never know unless something bad happens, and the same is true with teachers or others.
Cam, you are steeped in the activist world of Second Amendment rights protection. You know people, you know organizations, you know individual firearms owners, you know organizations. What's the take? I mean, not Washington, D.C. and New York and L.A. and that entire bubble world. Out in the rest of the country, where it really matters, frankly. What are people thinking? What are the concerns?
Well, I think gun owners are really concerned that that in an attempt to try to make us safer, we're actually going to make life more dangerous for law-abiding Americans. As John pointed out, all of the efforts here are focused on legal gun owners. There's not been one Democratic candidate who's mentioned violent criminals who are driving the vast majority of violent crime in this country. If you look at any given city, Baltimore, Maryland, Chicago, that's dealing with a violent crime problem, the people who are instigators of that violence are known to law enforcement. They're known to the good people in the bad neighborhoods. But time and time again, they're arrested, they're given a slap on the wrist, they're put right back out on the streets. And instead of dealing with our failed criminal justice system, each and every one of those Democratic candidates says, well, the answer is to go after Mr. and Mrs. America and take their guns away, and hopefully there'll be some sort of trickle-down effect that will ultimately impact those who are actually causing harm on our streets.
So law-abiding Americans who go into a gun store, find the firearm they're interested in, go through the process of purchasing it. Often folks who go through additional training, folks who want to get a concealed carry permit usually have to go through an entire process. Those folks are predisposed to following the law, right? They're doing all the things that are law-abiding, and yet somehow they come under the microscope, and they're the ones that are going to be checked, double-checked, rechecked, when really, in my view, it's a mental health issue. And when it comes to, and we'll bring this up a little bit later in greater depth, but when it comes to things like red flag laws, when you look at the killers that you've talked about, Rachel, I don't know what your instincts are with respect to this, but there's this lack of will on the Hill to address the real underlying problem. They go for cosmetics.
No, I think that's right. And I think, to Cam's point, the classic textbook case of this is the Odessa shooter, that tragic shooting that took place in Odessa, Texas. The shooter actually had a misdemeanor, should have been locked up, but was given 2 years of probation, so was never incarcerated. He had mental health issues on his record, so therefore was prohibited from purchasing a firearm under federal law, was unable to do so, so the law worked. However, he obtained his weapon from an illegal private sale. So private sales are legal, regulated in many states, but this seller was doing manufacturing and selling illegally. So again, This is a motivated criminal. This is not a law-abiding person, taking advantage of the law. That's a classic example, I think, of the issue we're actually trying to stop. None of the solutions actually get at that. And it tells us what we already know, that criminals don't care about extra laws. They don't.
Correct.
Yeah, just to emphasize, it's not a private sale per se that caused the problem in Odessa. It's that the person was manufacturing so-called ghost guns, and he didn't have a license to be able to go and manufacture the gun. So the transfer of that gun was punishable by 5 years in federal prison for doing that crime.
Cam, there's an enormous amount of pressure being brought on American businesses. There's leverage being attempted in order to force businesses to change their practices and to really sort of influence, culturally shift it through an economic attack by those on the left. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Sure. Well, right now what we've seen is that gun control advocates are asking for these companies to ban the open carry of firearms. But ideally what they really want is to ban the carrying of firearms in these establishments. We just saw 145 CEOs as well write a letter to the Senate urging them to pass quote-unquote universal background checks as well as red flag laws. This includes the CEOs of Twitter, of Yelp, of Airbnb. So you got a lot of folks in the tech industry, which frankly, a decade ago was very libertarian in its outlook, but now has become much more authoritarian in its outlook. And they are trying to use this corporate pressure to change the culture. Gun control advocates are very good at identifying influencers, be them celebrities, politicians, or again, corporate CEOs, and using that influence to try to leverage their position into cultural impositions on millions of Americans.
I want to drill down on that one point. You have 145 CEOs to get together to do a letter. That wasn't spontaneous.
Not at all.